Hello ladies and gentlemen, today we're doing a Hearts of Iron 4 tutorial on the Navy combat. We're going to have a couple of different sections we're going to go through. We're going to do different categories of ships, we're going to do composition of your fleet, and we're going to do Doctrine, and then we're also going to deal with a couple of situations and, well, how to deal with them. So let's first get into the different categories of ships. There are submarines, there are carriers, there's heavy capital ships, which is battleships and super heavies. Then we have quick capital ships, which are battle cruisers and heavy cruisers. Then we have screening ships, which is light cruisers and destroyers. Getting into all the differences between the two options you have at most of the categories. We're going to start with screening ships. It's basically just a decision of, do you want low-cost anti-submarine ships, destroyers, or high-cost anti-airships, cruisers. So what most people do is not actually just choose one or the other, but they will choose mostly destroyers, let's say 30 destroyers, and 5 to 6 light cruisers. The reason being for this mostly is because just the drastic difference between the cost in the two. At Tier 1, a destroyer is only 900 production cost versus a Tier 1 light cruiser at 3100. Now overall, light cruisers are a little bit better, but the difference in cost don't really add up to go only destroyers or only light cruisers. And the actual combat effectiveness doesn't add up to go only destroyers. So moving on from that, we're going to go into quick capital ships. There are heavy cruisers and battle cruisers. The differences between these two is that heavy cruisers are a little bit better at evasion, they are significantly weaker in armor, and health, and cost. The cost is only 4,200 at Tier 1 versus 7,500 at Tier 1. So in a Navy you typically want more heavy cruisers, but still some battle cruisers. Battle cruisers are kind of like a miniature battleship that is just a lot faster, a little bit moderately weaker, and overall just you want some, just maybe 3 or 4 of them in your fleet when you have 6 to 8 of them in your heavy cruisers in your fleet. These aren't defined numbers, you don't absolutely have to have them, but that's just kind of an example of what you could do. Moving on into heavy capital ships, we have the battleship and the super heavy battleship. These are very closely related, and it's basically just a matter of, can you accept the production cost of a super heavy battleship and get it out fast enough to make it not out of date by the time you actually start fighting with it. If you're able to get it out fast enough, then by all means go for a super heavy battleship. If you're not, then you go for a regular battleship. It's basically, do you want a good ship or do you want a great ship? You would ideally go for great, but the cost is the major factor in that one. Now moving on to carriers. Carriers are really nice. You don't have to necessarily upgrade them, but you should. The reason why you don't necessarily have to is because you're just launching aircraft off of it. Cool, you can get more for the next one, and more reliability at each level, and a little bit faster. But overall, you are just really using, airplanes. So, do you really need all those upgrades? If you can't afford it or you're tight on cost, you can kind of give a little bit of lax on your carriers when you're actually fighting and everything, when you're trying to decide what to make. One thing you could do to supplement carriers, if say you're not a very major naval power, and the perfect example is Nazi Germany through this time, is you could just use your land aircraft. But if you are going to use your land aircraft, you are going to have to invest in a radar. If you don't invest in a radar, your airplanes won't be able to find the enemy ships, and you'll be in a little bit of trouble there. And they'll be significantly worse at effectiveness versus a carrier plane. Finally, we can also go into submarines. Submarines are basically just used for convoy raiding. They can get lucky against full-size enemy fleets, and they can do very well against fleets without destroyers. So there is a reason why you do want to have quite a few destroyers, because if not, submarines are going to wreck your day. Now, moving on to composition of your fleet. In the ideal world, it doesn't really matter what number of ships you have, except for carriers. You can only have a maximum of 4 carriers, otherwise you're going to start getting penalties whenever you get into fights with other naval powers, and carriers become significantly less effective after that. So, ideally, 4 carriers per fleet. It doesn't matter how many battleships, as many as you can make is honestly the answer. Same for everything else, until you get to screens. Once you get to screens, you should generally have pretty much just 4 screening ships per 1 capital ship, including quick capital ships. So 4 for every battleship, 4 for every carrier, 4 for everything. You shouldn't just rely on only one type of ship. You should definitely always have a mix, even if it's not a huge mix. For example, you want more heavy cruisers than battle cruisers, but you don't want to completely ignore battle cruisers. You want more destroyers than light cruisers, but you don't necessarily want to just skip light cruisers. So basically you make a couple of light cruisers, a couple of battle cruisers, and you make a ton of destroyers and a ton of heavy cruisers, and you make a ton of battleships but only a few carriers, or as many super heavy battleships as you can, and only a couple of carriers, or only 4 carriers per fleet, that is. And then finally with submarines, the later on you go, the more you generally want to have per flotilla, wing, group. Otherwise you're just kind of gonna get sunk. They are very easy to get sunk, especially if you're going up against destroyers. So that's just something you should generally keep out for. Now, moving on to doctrines. As we can see, there are 3 different doctrines. There's Fleet and Being, Trade Interdiction, and Base Strike. Now, the differences between these is Fleet and Being is battleship focus, Base Strike is carrier focus, and Trade Interdiction is kind of just all around. If you're unsure, always go Trade Interdiction. If you're going to go mostly in on battleships, you should definitely go for Fleet and Being. It does have it's just good for traditional navies, which basically just means non-carrier navies. And then Base Strike. With Base Strike, what you generally want to keep in mind is skip the left and middle sub-trees in this one. The reason being is because they're just not very good, especially in comparison to everything else. And you should just kind of rush down the right-hand side of this and make as many carriers as you can to make this as effective as possible. That does mean having multiple fleets. So generally, Trade Interdiction is typically considered the best. It does have the most buffs, but it is quite a bit of research also. Moving on to the how to deal with what situations is what I'm going to call them. If you're going up against another navy, like a full powerhouse navy, you should generally just have the standard composition of your navy. No subs in the navy, but everything else I've gone over a little bit beforehand. If you're finding you're struggling with submarines, you can always just make a small group of destroyers of about equal size and just have them hunt down in that area. That will sink them probably sooner rather than later, and it'll get that annoying mess out of your hair for you. If you just need to absolutely destroy the navy and you own the land, you should just kind of go with planes actually. Give them radar and they will be able to just destroy the enemy navies as long as they can spot them using the radar. So radar is fairly important for air and sea combat. Well, that'll be all for today. If you have any suggestions, anything you'd like me to go over, please leave it down in the comments, and we'll see you next time.